Today I want to talk about faction weapons, which I think are a really cool way to characterise different groups within an RPG, but are often overlooked in favour of a more obvious faction armour. Here's a couple of quick examples to test my point. Can you tell which faction these two belong to? How about now? Suddenly becomes a lot easier. And it's not just Skyrim where this is the case. This New Vegas character is hardly recognisable, but when wearing faction armour, they're an instant icon. From a purely visual standpoint, armour's always going to be the easier way to identify members of a faction, but as video games are an interactive medium, I believe there's much more of interest that can be done on the weapon side of things. Before I head into my main example, which is going to be another Fallout game, I want to take a look at my first example, and a couple of others too, in order to show some examples of how this concept can work. In the Skyrim Civil War, you will usually see Imperial soldiers wielding the Imperial Sword, and Stormcloaks with an Iron Battle Axe. These two weapons do a remarkably good job of showcasing each faction, but it's something the game never really spells out for you. The Imperial Sword is a blade wielded exclusively by those serving the Empire. You will see it on Imperial soldiers and Hold Guards, but that's all. Conversely, the Iron Battle Axe is used by far more than just the Stormcloaks. It's a weapon that a huge variety of NPCs wield, and it's not a mass-produced weapon for an army, but a standard item from the realm of Skyrim. It's not just a weapon, but also a tool, as shown through the one unique variant of the item being the Woodsman's Friend. It's an axe that was used to chop down trees in the many forests across Skyrim, but with the rebellion underway, this tool is now seeing more use as a weapon of war, as local rebels don't have access to the same distribution of arms that the Empire does. So instead of being granted a blade forged from steel upon signing up, Stormcloaks are much more likely to have to just use whatever it is they had available to them. This split on the weapons helps to showcase that the Stormcloaks are made up from the denizens of Skyrim, and that the army itself doesn't have the sort of funding, resources or infrastructure in place to equip every soldier with strong steel. The Empire, on the other hand, is well established, albeit a foreign power reigning over these lands. As such, they can import steel weapons of their own design and hand them out to all the soldiers in their service. And this is just one way you can view the divide between weapons. You could read into the difference between the choice of one-handed and two-handed weaponry. The Legion is attempting to defend their empire, so they have a shield or are only half focused on the attack, whereas the Stormcloaks are full on the offensive, being the one who initiated the fight and are looking to aggressively take back what they believe to be theirs. This is far from a one-off example where the weapons wielded help to define the members of a faction. In the world of Warhammer 40,000, the Imperial Legion's weapon of choice is the lasgun. This is a cheap, mass-produced weapon with little strength, but it's incredibly reliable and customizable. For the lasgun to be deemed a threat, it needs to be used in great numbers. Likewise, the Imperial Guard themselves are very weak as individuals, but when used en masse, they become a force to be reckoned with. And on the flip side in the same universe, we have the Space Marines, who wield the bolt gun. These are handcrafted weapons of war, each one having to undergo special rituals before it ever sees battle. And that description right there applies to both the Marines themselves and their signature weapon. It's a great way to help exemplify and enhance a faction, by creating this link between their main weapon and those who wield it. When it's done in this way, it truly is a wonderful thing, but for the remainder of this video, there's just one game I want to focus on: Fallout 4. This isn't because I think Fallout 4 is the best example of faction weaponry, nor is it the worst. The reason I want to focus on this game is because it spans the entire range. When looking at faction weaponry, there's two factors which can be either good or bad. There's the weapon itself, and then there's how the weapon has been implemented. And rather than waste time with additional examples of what I mean by that, let's just go into Fallout 4 and I'll explain as we go. We're going to start with the faction who I've scored as bad on both the weapon and the implementation front, and that is the Brotherhood of Steel. Now, to be fair, I don't actually blame Bethesda for this one. That will come next. The problem here is that the Brotherhood are a pre-established faction, having appeared in every single Fallout game prior. In order to give them a super well-defined faction weapon, you'd have to retcon so much stuff, and fans already get mad over the smallest of rewrites in the franchise, so understandably, that wasn't done. You could say that the laser rifle is the faction weapon for the Brotherhood, but it doesn't quite fit. This is a gun that's used extensively throughout the Wasteland on both coasts. It doesn't seem to hold any special significance to this faction in particular, and among the members it's simply one of a whole arsenal of weaponry that is used. You could say that it's a high-tech weapon for a high-tech faction, but that's pretty much the strongest link. While the Brotherhood still kind of fails on the faction weapon front, I don't think it's too big an issue due to the incredibly strong link they have with their faction armour, power armour. You see a suit of power armour and instantly the first thing that pops into your mind are these guys. It's a shame they don't have a specific weapon to generate that same feeling, but I understand why it's not the case. What I don't understand is what went wrong with the next faction. The next one is an example of good implementation, but a bad weapon, and this time around it's the Institute. Simps everywhere use the Institute laser, and it's not seen being used by anyone except those who are members of the group. That's a great example of a weapon being clearly tied to a faction. And much like with the attempted example with the Brotherhood, this is a high-tech weapon being used by a high-tech faction. My question then is, why does the weapon suck so bad? It's very clearly based on the laser gun, but made so much worse. Take a look at the base stats for both these weapons. The Institute laser has slightly higher fire rate, which is literally its only advantage. This could have been a good thing, if it wasn't for the fact it dishes out nearly half the damage. To get proper numbery for a bit, the Institute laser dishes out 62.5% of the damage that the standard laser gun does, while having a third faster fire rate. What this basically means is that the Institute laser fires 4 shots for every 3 shots the laser gun does. With 3 shots from a laser gun, you're looking at 72 points of damage. With 4 shots from the Institute laser, you're looking at 60 damage. That is a huge difference in equivalent DPS over the course of what can be about a single second in a firefight. And this disparity only gets worse as you upgrade these weapons. And while we're on the subject of upgrades, why is it that the Institute laser has less customization options than the run-of-the-mill laser gun? It would make so much more sense for it to be the other way around. Make it so that the standard laser gun has limited options, and the one which the Institute have been tinkering with for years has a lot more options, and can be customised for different things. But no, that's not how it works at all. It's just a flat-out worse weapon. They took the laser gun, messed around with it, and made it fundamentally worse. Alright, I got a little heated there, so I'm going to give myself a moment to cool down. This whole video actually came about because I was doing research into the Institute laser while working on my Rewriting the Institute video. The rant didn't fit in there, but it got me thinking about faction weapons in general, so now we're here. And now we're back on the subject, I think the problem with the weapon really is that the Institute are framed as this technological powerhouse. They're able to replicate synthetic people, create an underground society free from the dangers above, and even build a goddamn teleporter. Yet when it comes to their faction weapon, it entirely fails to reflect their technological superiority. If you only had the laser to go off and you had to design the faction based around that, then you'd assume they were cheap and incompetent. In terms of the weapon itself, this is just flat out bad as a faction weapon. But when we look at the implementation, that's actually good. Not only is it wielded exclusively and extensively by the Institute, with virtually no other weapon in sight when facing them, but it even has their faction in the weapon's name. The visual design was made to fit in with the colours of Simps and their armour, and it's once again just a real shame that the weapon itself is so poorly designed. And to be clear here, this isn't a case of, oh, the weapon sucks, therefore it's a bad faction weapon. It's a case of, the faction should have a strong weapon because it's a strong faction, and weak factions can have weaker weapons. Just want to get that cleared up before we move forward. It's probably about time to flip the failings, and move on to the faction who this time have a good weapon but bad implementation. And for this one, we're looking at the Railroad. I have just said that the faction weapon for the Railroad is good, but there is a bit of a question as to what the faction weapon is. I'm betting that for some of you, you'll have guessed the Deliverer, the unique pistol you're given on your first proper mission with the Railroad. Others will have said the Railway Rifle, but probably only if you've dealt with the faction in the very endgame. Personally, I'd go with the latter. While the Deliverer is great, and the stealthy nature of it does reflect the faction well, it's also a true unique, which means it doesn't really qualify as a faction weapon. A faction weapon needs to be something that the members of a faction can wield, and very much is linked to those members. And so, we're left with the Railway Rifle. First off, this weapon is a lot of fun. If you've played Fallout 4 but not tried it out, then I'm going to recommend booting the game back up and getting your hands on one, as it is such a weird weapon that it's worth playing around with. In terms of how it works as a faction weapon though, we have a couple of things to look at. The first is the stealthy nature, which surprisingly, this weapon kind of has. It's certainly not on the same level as a fully suppressed gun like the Deliverer, but the Railway Rifle still isn't crazy loud, and it works best as a stealth weapon. Due to the slow projectile speed and devastating limb damage, the most effective way to use this weapon is to be stealthy with it. It's a shame that it doesn't have a suppressed option, as then it could get full marks here, but it still does at least have somewhat of a link to the faction in this area. Where the better link comes in, and the part which I think makes it a good faction weapon, is in the way it's clearly a cobbled together, scrappy kind of thing. The Railroad is not a powerful faction. They don't have the same level of resources of the previous two groups, and they have to rely on one clearly crazy guy to do all their weapon development for them. And this is 100% a weapon that a nutjob like Tinker Tom would come up with when left alone with nothing but scraps and old world junk. In fact, there's even an event in-game where you can see Tom testing out a prototype of a railway rifle. This is clearly not a mass-manufactured weapon built in an official armoury, but a strange construct that has to use air pressure in order to get the job done. It reflects the scrappy nature of the Railroad, and shows that they'll use whatever is at hand to get the job done. That's the reason I think it works fairly well as a faction weapon. It's a shame then that the implementation side of things is a real letdown. You will so rarely see members of the Railroad actually wield this weapon. Technically it can show up on members of the faction towards the end of the main story, and apparently it's carried by Desdemona during the quest Tactical Thinking, but the actual chances of you seeing a Railroad agent wielding this custom rifle is shockingly low. The problem is that, rather than have this be the default weapon used by named members of the faction and their agents, it instead is often overlooked for a huge number of different guns. Take a look at what the fandom page lists in the inventory of the generic Railroad agents. That's so many other firearms that can be wielded. And on top of this, the only quest that these characters show up in is the Battle of Bunker Hill and Tactical Thinking. That's two quests where you have a chance to see the faction weapon being wielded by members of the faction, but you have a much higher chance of seeing them use something else. This is where the bad implementation comes into play. This is such a cool weapon and could have been a proper feature of the faction, but instead it gets ignored half the time. I imagine there's plenty of people who have beat Fallout 4 who never even came across this gun, as it's just so rare to actually see. But when it comes to the best faction weapon in Fallout 4, this is one which every player will have come across. It's time to talk about the Minutemen, and their faction weapon, the Laser Musket. This is a brilliant example, which knocks it out the park in terms of both the weapon itself and how it's implemented within the Minutemen. So first up, the Laser Musket is either terrible or brilliant, depending on who you ask. The thing is, this isn't an easy weapon to use well, and it's one which really benefits from you building it up. Much like the Lasgun from 40k, this is another weapon which isn't great when used by one individual, as the constant reloading leaves you vulnerable. But when everyone has a laser musket in hand, then suddenly things get a lot more deadly. A single basic laser musket isn't as accurate as one would like, nor is as deadly as you'd want, but when either everyone is armed with one and can cover each other, or when the player character upgrades it through the crafting system, it becomes a much stronger weapon. This mentality of having to either rely on others or build it up fits in really well with the Minutemen as a faction. They're not particularly strong at the start of the game, but if you put in the time and work with them, they can become a real contender in the Commonwealth. And this weapon works just the same. You'll see in the footage that this is the weapon that I have the most success with, being able to take on a whole host of high-level super mutants when relatively low-level myself. Not only is this a really cool item, but it also has historical links to the muskets of old. These were the weapons of choice for many of the Minutemen from hundreds of years ago, and this post-apocalypse variant harks back to those times, while giving its own sci-fi spin to things. I absolutely adore this as a faction weapon, and best of all, it's actually implemented well. Not only does the player character get access to it right at the start of the game, finding it by the corpse of a Minuteman, but it's also the weapon of choice of the last Minuteman, Preston Garvey. This immediately ties it into the faction in a meaningful way, but it doesn't end there. When you start encountering generic Minutemen as you play, they will often be wielding this weapon, because of course they will. It's the weapon of the Minutemen. It makes sense that they wield it. But it's not just on the random NPC members who you run across. Multiple copies of it show up at the castle, the Old Minuteman HQ, and when you complete the quest Old Guns, Ronnie Shaw will sell variants of the weapon. And she's the only vendor who sells them. That's right, the faction weapon is only sold by the faction merchant. You hear that, Shattered Space? It's a merchant of the faction selling items that are linked to the faction, rather than just any generic shit you feel like. The Laser Musket is such a perfect example of a video game item which nails the faction weapon requirements, but I can't help but love it. and hope that more developers take note. Or, the same developers take note too, I guess, as Bethesda haven't really matched this level of faction weapons since. I hope you all enjoyed listening to my somewhat overexcited ramblings on faction weapons, but this is something I really love and I feel like doesn't get much acknowledgement. Faction armor seems to get all the attention as it's the visual set piece, but I feel that the weapons can often get overlooked. Not by me though, I love them. Anyway, thank you all for sticking around. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, share the video around and leave a comment if you have your own thoughts, and as always, thanks for watching. Sarge out.